Head of Adult Services here at UCPL. I am really excited that you have all decided to read the Odyssey with us this summer. The response to this year's book has been record-breaking. We have more than 170 people signed up to read with us, which is incredible. So if you haven't gotten a copy of the book yet, because we do have more people than books, we hope to have one soon. We're getting more. If you'd rather not wait around, I urge you to go visit our friends down the street at Subterranean Books. That's where we got a bunch of ours, and so they know to keep some in stock. So after tonight, we have a great lineup of programs related to this book throughout the summer, including monthly discussions. Our first one will be, if you look on your bookmarks or whatever, it will be on Wednesday, June 25th, I believe. That's what I didn't write down, of course. And that will be over books 1 through 8 of the Odyssey. Our first cultural program will also be our first adult summer reading field trip. The July 9th trip to the St. Louis Art Museum is currently full, but we do have a wait list running just in case the spot opens up. So if you're interested in that, just stop by the reference desk downstairs and let them know. They'll get you signed or get you on that wait list. Also, for those who are not able to make it, our friends at the Art Museum are doing a wonderful favor for us, and they're working on creating a guide of the works that we will be seeing. So that will hopefully be ready by the time we get to the tour. So if you're not able to go, you can do a self-guided tour later on. So we'll also welcome the St. Nicholas Greek Dance Troupe for a performance of traditional, though not quite this traditional, Greek dance on July 16th. And then we'll have a movie night on August 6th where we watch the Coen brothers' satirical take on the Odyssey, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? All of the times and dates for everything are listed on your bookmarks, in your reader guides, and of course on our website. And before I introduce our keynote speaker tonight, a few housekeeping notes. If you need them, the restrooms are out that door in the back and to your left. Feel free to grab some snacks. I will try and reload them as the night goes on, because, and I also have a few giveaways at the back. I'm sure most of you saw the cart of books, whole bunch of free books. Last few years I've been on a committee for the American Library Association where they send me like 1,000 fiction novels, and I want to share them. So my husband wants me to share them. So feel free to take those along. We also have coupons for free lemonade from Cane's, and some UCPL bumper stickers, and of course the reader guide back there. And then finally, I'd like to ask everybody to please fill out a quick survey at the end of tonight's event. Those surveys help us plan and help us get funding in the future. So our grant writers really appreciate that. So now I'm thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Kate Wilson, who will give us an introduction to the Odyssey in general and to this translation in particular. Dr. Wilson is a senior lecturer in the John and Penelope Biggs Department of Classics at Washington University, where she teaches Greek mythology and Homeric epic, both in English and in Greek. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and she works on Greek literature and culture with a particular focus on interactions with the natural world and concepts of work in the ancient world. She relishes any opportunity to talk about Homer that comes her way, and she just returned from an educational trip to Greece with her students, which we are also jealous of. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Kate.
Not so well. Not so well. Okay, I will try and project. Hopefully this microphone will help. Yeah? Okay. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to see so much interest in the Odyssey. I wanted to start with a couple of thank yous myself. First of all to Kara and to the U City Public Library staff for inviting me to take part in this Summer Big Book Challenge. and also for being willing to move the keynote talk. As Kara mentioned, I wasn't able to do it in May, which I think is when it usually happens, because I was in Greece. I feel a little bad saying. I did have 20 undergraduates with me, so it wasn't exactly a day in the beach. But I did take this picture there, so. This is from a beach near Pylos, which is a place that we are going to encounter in our first big chunk of the Odyssey. Sandy Pylos is what it's called, and I thought this is a great way to show you where that name comes from. Thank you all for being willing to do this keynote with a little bit of a short space before the first reading discussion in 2 weeks. I'm also moved to have sort of a broader gratitude for the U City Public Library from a personal perspective, because while I was off gallivanting in Greece, a tornado went through my neighborhood, not too far from here, and damaged my building. And my partner works remotely, and we were without power. And so he, in the aftermath, started to come here during the day to do his job and charge his devices and get information. And it really just struck me how fortunate we are to have this library in our community as a resource in good times and bad. So thank you to... I do hope the summer reading program is part of those good times. And I am very excited for this project. As Kara mentioned in the introduction, I do teach the Odyssey quite often in various different classes of mine. I read it maybe once a year, and every time I find something new. If this is your first time reading the poem or your 50th, I think that it'll be a really valuable experience for all of us, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts in the reading discussions going forward. And for the purposes of this talk, though, I'm going to kind of assume no great familiarity with the poem as a whole, just so that we can all start on the same page. I put an outline here of my talk. Kara did tell me not to put any spoilers in my talk. And then I put this meme up there, and I thought, oh, that might count as a spoiler. But you do actually learn this information in the first 10 lines of the poem. So I don't think it counts. So the plan for tonight is I'm going to start with some of just sort of general cultural background about ancient Greece that I think is relevant for understanding the poem. And then talk about the very thorny question of the composition of the Odyssey. When was it composed? By whom was it composed? How was it composed? All of these very complicated questions that I may not have satisfying answers for. And then I do want to give you a little bit of mythological backstory, because the Odyssey is a story that comes at sort of the tail end of a large mythic arc of the Trojan War. And the audience would have been very familiar with many of the plot events that had happened beforehand and the characters who had been part of that. And a lot of them are going to crop up in various ways during the Odyssey. So I thought it would be useful to just give a little bit of an overview of that story up until the point where the Odyssey begins, so that you can sort of have some more familiarity when you encounter them for the first time. And then finally, well, not quite finally, I do want to talk about themes of the poem to kind of help you, I don't want to direct, I think that's a little too maybe strong of a term, but guide your reading as you go into this first section with sort of some of the things that I would recommend looking out for, and ways to think about it, some questions to kind of prompt you as you are diving in. And then lastly, as Kara mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about the translation we're using by Emily Wilson, no relation. You know, I think that her translation can help us think a little bit about the language of the Odyssey and some issues with using translations in general, and some things that are sort of worth knowing about her translation in particular. So that's the plan for the night. I'm going to try and stick to my script as much as possible. I can get a little long-winded if I don't, and I want to make sure there's lots of time at the end for any questions or comments that people have. So I'm going to just jump right in with what is ancient Greece. First of all, we do want to think beyond the borders of the modern nation of Greece. This map that I've put up here shows in red the range of Greek settlements. I'm going to try and just project away from the microphone. You can see here's the modern country of Greece, right? But you can see all along, you know, all three coasts of the modern country of Turkey. We have Greek settlements here in the Black Sea area. That's Crimea, if you need to orient yourself. The southern coast of Italy, the northern coast of Africa, even all the way into Spain and France, right? We have quite a range of places where we find Greek settlements in antiquity. Just a couple of places while we have this map up here that I wanted to point out for future reference. The first of all being Ithaca, which is Odysseus' home. That's the island that we're trying to get to this whole time. And that's right around here on the sort of, it's an island on the sort of western coast of the modern country of Greece in that area. He's coming from Troy, which is, depending on the US, somewhere around here in this kind of northwestern Asia Minor area. So that's Troy, that's Ithaca, and then last, because I'm going to bring it up again later, Pylos, the town that we saw, the beach that we saw in the first slide, that's on the coast of Greece right here, just a little bit west of Sparta's inland, and then Pylos is on the coast here. So those are three places that are kind of worth orienting yourself in, but as you can see, Greece is a much, much bigger place than just those places. I've already gotten off of my script. So all of these settlements are not one nation or one empire. They are individual little city-states. Polis, that's our first Greek word of the night. The singular is polis, right, the Greek word for city. So these polis, they are independently governed, although some have, some connections and some are founded as colonies of the other. These polis ally with each other, they fight with each other, they trade with each other, but they also do all of that with the other civilizations around the Mediterranean, such as the Egyptians and the Phoenicians. So it's really better to think not of one entity called Greece at all, but rather to think about this ancient Mediterranean network of intersecting cultures, some of whom think of themselves as Greek. So if they're not politically united, and as you can see they are fairly geographically spread out, what makes them Greek? Broadly speaking, they have cultural ties. They speak the same language, mostly, and they worship the same gods, mostly. You can tell I'm such an academic. I'm going to put caveats on every sentence I say. But one of the really big unifying things that links all of these little individual polis together are the stories they tell, like the Odyssey. The Odyssey and the other Homeric epic, the Iliad, are two of the most foundational keystones of Greek culture. It's really hard to overstate how important the Odyssey and the Iliad are for the Greeks as a way to construct Greek identity. It's kind of like if you had the Bible and Wikipedia and the works of Shakespeare all rolled into one thing. Greek religion does not have doctrinal religious texts like other religions, and the Odyssey is not direct words of a god, but the Homeric epics are about as close as the Greeks have to that kind of a religious authority. But they're also considered an authority for all other types of information. Homer is, for some later Greek readers, a military general, a doctor, a geographer, a philosopher. The epics are reference manuals that can provide all sorts of practical information and moral lessons. And the cultural and artistic cachet of these poems are also supreme. Homer is the greatest poet to the Greeks, and all poetry that comes later is in some way measured against the achievements of these epics. So that's just a little bit about why the Odyssey matters. Another thing that links all of these Greek polis together is that, as you can see, none of them are particularly far from the coast. Greek culture is fundamentally a maritime culture of sea voyages and trading. Today we often think of landmass as the central focus of any country, the territory that they inhabit. But for the Greeks, the central geographical feature is the Mediterranean Sea. The Latin name is literally the middle of the earth. And the Odyssey is, in part, a story about a sea journey. And you can see why that would be so important in a culture where sea voyages are a central part of life. The other major aspect of the culture that produced the Odyssey I want to highlight is the importance of music and song. As you're reading the poem, this is my first invitation of the talk, I invite you to take note of when and where people are singing and playing instruments. The world of the Odyssey is permeated with music. It is a culture that has a type of song for every part of life and every occasion. Songs for when you're rowing on a ship, songs for when you're weaving, songs for weddings, for funerals, for specific religious rituals, and songs you sing to commemorate important cultural narratives. The Odyssey is itself one such song. I've been calling it a poem, but in this time period, all poetry is really sung music. Only the lyrics survive, but we should still think of it as music. The Odyssey is a specific type of song. It's an epic, it's the term I've already been using for it. Epic poetry is the highest form of poetry for the Greeks. It is that last category that is that is used for remembering, for passing down the stories that matter the most to people. Stories of big wars and long journeys and the gods themselves. But it's also supposed to be an entertaining genre, right? These are the stories that you tell for fun as well. So I think you will notice as we're reading that music is quite omnipresent in the poem, and it gives us a little window into that song culture that the Odyssey was created within. That song culture is very important for this messy issue of when the poem was composed, which is my next subject tonight. I've been very cagey about dates so far, intentionally. This is a topic that scholars care very deeply about, and the evidence is limited and never definitive, and so it's kind of a perfect breeding ground for bitter academic disputes. I have my own opinions, but I wouldn't say that I'm particularly dogmatic about them, so I thought what I would do here is to take you through a timeline of Greek history as it relates to the Odyssey, and show you some of the evidence as it stands. And the truth is that this book, right, with printed on paper in English, is very far from where the poem started. So, to reach that origin, let's go all the way back to 1300 BCE, which is a period that we call the Bronze Age in Greek history. And more specifically, this is a period that we call the Mycenaean palace culture, because, well, you'll see in a minute. This is the settlement by that beach that I showed you before in Pylos, and this on sort of the highest kind of level point in the area, there was a large complex called a palace, that was inhabited by one family, so presumably the royal family of Pylos lived there. In the Odyssey, the name of the king of Pylos is Nestor, so we call this the Palace of Nestor. We always want to remember that there's no evidence for an actual historical person named Nestor here. We just use that name because we like to tie things to the Homeric epics. The central feature of this palace, as you can see, is a large throne room. So this is what it looks like today on top, and on the bottom you can see a reconstruction. This is a standard feature of all the palaces that we see. in the Mycenaean period. And this is the room, as you can tell from the name, the throne room. This is where the king would hold court. At the center, you can see this round circle. That was a hearth, right? So there would be a fire burning there, and then these 4 columns around it. So it should be open air directly above the hearth. It's a little bit hard to see that. One of the central functions of this room was to host large communal feasts. That's another big theme in the Odyssey. People are always having large communal feasts. In the reconstruction, you can see that in this room, which was used for those feasts, just how incredibly ornately decorated it was. The entire room is covered in these really beautiful painted frescoes. And the decorations on the walls of the room are highly symbolic. So next to the king, for example, you can kind of see a little bit of a lion in the corner there. Right, they painted lions next to the throne where the king would sit. By the hearth, they had fires. But on some of the walls, we have paintings, or there were paintings of people feasting, right? So that's good evidence for the use of this room for dining. And the one painting that I want to zero in on is this one that I've blown up for you on the right here, of a man sitting on some kind of very intricately colored thing and playing this instrument that looks maybe kind of like a harp or a guitar, right? That's called a lyre. And this man is a bard. He's a singer who would be performing, playing the lyre and singing along to it during these feasts. It's really a perfect demonstration of how central musical entertainment was to these feasts. And probably the type of song that these bards would play at these feasts was epic, right? These long narrative, entertaining stories about important men and deeds. It's a bit speculative for me to start in this palace, but it is possible that places like this are where the stories that we find in the Odyssey were first told. Not necessarily in any form like the one we have, but that these bards created a mythic world and a tradition of oral storytelling, or rather maybe story singing. There was writing in the palace of Nestor, but it was used for receipts and contracts and other boring bureaucratic things. Stories were preserved in song, not in writing. So these bards might invent a song out of nothing. They might take a song they heard from somewhere else and adapt it to their audience and their own interests. Because we have no records of these songs, we can't say anything definitively. Later Greeks thought that the events of the Odyssey took place at around the time when this room would have been in use. And the very earliest datable objects that appear in the poem come from about this time as well. So, and we can see here, of course, that there is already a tradition of musical accompaniment to the types of feasts that were happening here. So that's my justification for suggesting that maybe we could think of these palaces as a place where the stories of the Odyssey were first starting to take hold. At the end of the Bronze Age, this palace and most of the other powerful Greek settlements were destroyed. This culture of large palaces ruled by a king who hosts big communal feasts pretty much just collapses. We don't have time to get into why, but what follows are about 3 centuries in which the population of Greece is much smaller. There's less monumental building, and writing disappears completely. We call this the Greek Dark Age because we don't really know much about what's happening. Archaeological remains are fewer, and because there's no writing, it's very difficult to say anything about what stories were being told during this time, in what context. But the storytelling tradition did continue, and it is probably in this mysterious black box centuries that the tales about Odysseus and the Trojan War started to take shape alongside other big mythic narratives like Jason and the Voyage of the Argo. The end of the Dark Ages marks a transition in Greek culture to what we label the Archaic period. So I've put sort of a timeline here if you'd like dates, and just with sort of the standard periodization that we use in Greek history. So this transition from the Iron Age / Dark Age to the Archaic period is a major transition, and that's right when the Homeric epics emerged, probably. If you want one date to kind of hang your hat on and say, this is when the Odyssey was composed, I'm going to give you 700 BCE. This is obviously not a definite date, but it's the one that most scholars land on when they start weighing all of the evidence. There are linguistic features in the Greek that we know are older than other Greek literature, and there are objects described in the poems, some of which cannot be any earlier than around this time, right? So we have linguistic evidence telling us it can't be later, and archaeological evidence telling us it can't be earlier, and we sort of triangulate to that date of around 700. The Homeric epics are drawing on that earlier tradition of oral composition and song, but the scale of the composition seems to be an innovation. If those earlier epics had survived, it's not likely they would qualify for a big book challenge. The Odyssey is a long poem, you may have noticed, as is the Iliad, and this seems to reflect a transition in the culture towards more people, more contact with other cultures again, and more monumental building. This is also when writing re-enters the Greek world, a new alphabetic system based on the Phoenician system of writing, so another indication of the greater interaction with the wider world that Greece is having at this moment. Our next piece of evidence comes from about 150 years later, about 566 BCE, when a new religious festival was instituted in the city of Athens, one that included a competition in reciting the Homeric epics. This is a very intriguing piece of information. First of all, it tells us that in the intervening time, the poems have continued to spread and gain in popularity to such a degree that they are now the text that you would use for such a competition. I shouldn't say text, they are the works you would use for such a competition. But it also does suggest that a text of these poems exists, because how do you judge who is remembering them most accurately if you don't have some standard to compare them to, right? So 566 is when we say fairly confidently some written version of this poem exists. It's possible that those singers who were singing it in between this time have changed it a little bit, but because of the evidence that I already talked about, we do think that the poem that was being performed in 566 looked pretty much the same as the one that was being performed in 700. How were they spreading and being passed down in the intervening time between 700 and 566? Well, maybe in writing, or maybe by memory. It does sometimes seem incredible, but studies of modern cultures with oral song traditions has revealed that there are aspects of the poem that would aid not only in its original composition, but also in its transmission by memory afterwards. So it is possible that these singers memorized and recited it for performance over and over for about 150 years before anybody ever wrote it down. And it's possible small things changed, but obviously not very much. It does mean that we should think about the Odyssey as something that grew rather than was composed in the way a modern author creates their own work. Even the poet who composed it around 700 was undoubtedly drawing on that earlier tradition, and later singers are probably tinkering with it as well. It is a poem that no one single person can take complete credit for. We attribute it to Homer, but that is just a convenient name to use, not a historical person we can give details about. The next point in the history of the poem that I want to highlight is almost 300 years later, after the popularity and cultural significance of the poems has only continued to rise, and writing has become widespread and common. A lot of history takes place in that intervening period that I'm just glossing over. But around 300, we have the creation of the library in Alexandria in Egypt. The library at Alexandria became an intellectual cultural center, housing many scholars who were working on a wide range of subjects: geography, medicine, history, all overseen by the head librarian. The very first head librarian was a man named Xenocrates, a pun name, and his main project was to create the first authoritative text of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It seems that at this point, there were many texts of the poems circulating, some quite different from each other. And he collected as many of these variants as he could and decided, based on various rationales and his own personal opinions, which version he thought was authentic. He basically invented a profession, the textual editor, and that still exists in classics today. We are entirely reliant for the text we have today on decisions that were made by these textual editors at the Library of Alexandria about what they thought was the correct version of this poem. There is an implicit assumption in Xenocrates' project that there is one true, authentic version of these poems. This is an idea that I think we should avoid. Xenocrates and his followers at the library, who continued to work on editions of these poems for several centuries, had a concept of a person named Homer who created these poems and whose genius had been obscured by the mistakes of various performers over the centuries. It is more accurate to think of the poem as an organic, dynamic thing that has no one single true form, but a myriad of forms, none more or less valid than the others. The version that we are reading is an English translation based on a modern critical edition of the Greek text. That critical edition that Emily Wilson uses is based on the same process of evaluation of evidence as Xenocrates, hopefully slightly more objective rationales. But the modern editor is only using manuscripts that date from the 10th and the 11th centuries CE, manuscripts that are copies of copies of copies of copies of the text that go back to antiquity, possibly to the editions created in the Library of Alexandria. So it's very hard to answer the question of when the Odyssey is created. Do we mean when the stories about Odysseus and his journey started to take shape sometime in the Iron Age? Or when one poet brought them all together in one complete whole around 700? Or when there was a version official enough to compete over? Or when Xenocrates created a critical edition of the text? Any of these dates would count as the creation of the text we are reading, depending on what aspects of it we want to emphasize. So there is our timeline. Now let's get into the controversies. Starting with the dating, that date 700. I would say that that is the most commonly accepted date, but some people will tell you it is earlier or later. A corollary, maybe larger debate, is the question of what form it took in 700. There are scholars who think it was written down